Hello, everyone. I hope you had a restful break from tutorial and assignments last week after you submitted your research proposal. So this will be quite a short tutorial covering the topic that we have already discussed a little, which is data collection. However, I now want you to think about it from a bit of a different perspective. So not like you're proposing to collect the data in the future, but like you're ready to go out and collect it right now. But we'll get into that more in a couple slides. So first, as usual, I want to give some general feedback on your research proposal papers. Many of you wrote comprehensive, well-researched proposals, and I was absolutely blown away by the quality of a few of them, so great work. Of course, check my comments either throughout the Word document if you submitted it in a document format, or on Canvas if you submitted it through a PDF format for detailed feedback specific to your own paper, and be sure to address it when writing your final report. So aside from that, here are some general themes. And of course, it's good practice to just go through these while I'm talking about them and just double check to see if they apply to your own paper, even if I maybe didn't highlight it as a major issue. So in quite a few papers, the example section is unclear or missing completely. This is a tricky section, I know, but if you recall, I recommended including it as the very first paragraph of your whole paper and keeping it to a paragraph or two at the very most, and almost using it as an introduction section before you go into your literature review. In this section, you want to briefly describe why your study is important and interesting to both you as the researcher and society as a whole. It's okay to get a little personal here, but you also want to keep the writing formal and include citations if you make any broad claims. So for example, if you start to describe a psychological disorder, you'd need to cite after stating its symptoms. Or if you make a claim like many people worldwide have begun to experience poor mental health due to the COVID-19 pandemic, you would need a citation after that. However, if you make a more general statement that is considered just common knowledge, such as the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted many people's lives in different ways, you wouldn't need a citation for that. Next, you must include rationale, or in other words, support from previous research studies immediately before or after you state your hypothesis. This did frustrate me while reading your proposals, as I've highlighted this so many times and a fair number of students are still not including it. Again, this short discussion of prior research findings explains why you are predicting your independent variable and dependent variable will be related in the way you state within your hypothesis. It is not enough for you to simply say why you think they will be related in that way with no discussion of research. I really don't want to have to talk about this again, so I probably won't after this tutorial, but please book a meeting with me if you still have any questions surrounding this issue. So some methods sections were missing information or just poorly organized. If you were missing something crucial that made me unable to generate data for you, I was sure to let you know in your feedback. So if you don't see that in your feedback, you don't need to provide me with any additional information, but you still may have missed something important, like how you will recruit your participants. I saw that a couple times. As for organization, it was expected for you to subdivide your methods into the typical sections: participants, procedure, and materials. You'll see this general structure in pretty much every published research article you read. Because so many students didn't do this, I'll be going over subsections and what should be included within them again later in this tutorial. So please pay attention, and if you didn't do this in the proposal, please revise your methods section in the final report to look like this. And finally, if you received a lower mark than you were anticipating, it's also possible that you did not include one or more key sections. I saw this most frequently for the prediction or anticipated results section and for the appendices. So quite a number of students discussed a pre-existing or self-made measure that they were using for data collection, but did not attach it in an appendix. So this is why I strongly recommend students to review the grading rubric before submitting any major assignments. Okay, so now that you've stated what you intend to do data collection wise in a formal research proposal, in reality, you would need to go out and actually collect your data and do it. Depending on the project, if you were a real researcher, quote unquote, the data collection stage could take anywhere from just a single day, even though that is quite uncommon, to multiple years, with most studies falling somewhere in the middle of that and taking anywhere from a couple months to a year for their data collection. If you were taking this class in person, we would have blocked off 2 to 3 tutorials, and each of you would have been allotted about 15 minutes to actually conduct a small study using your fellow students as participants. Of course, this would have meant the studies you proposed would have had to be much simpler, but it also shows rationale for why we require certain things, such as appendices with the actual data collection materials to be included in your proposal. So if you were doing it in person, you would need to have the actual measures of your variables prepared and on hand, or else you just wouldn't be able to conduct your study. So with all this in mind, we'll now revisit data collection strategies in this tutorial. These will be slightly different from the overview I gave a couple tutorials ago, and these can be found in your course textbook, so we're just reviewing those. Please use these in this tutorial as the categories you use to inform your 7th weekly assignment and study for the second assessment or exam if you do use these tutorials to study. While we go through them, the collection strategies and their strengths and limitations, I recommend considering which strategy aligns most closely with how you proposed you would collect your data for your project. A bit of a spoiler, this will help you complete assignment 7. The 6 major methods of data collection discussed in your course textbook are as follows: a test or assessment, questionnaires, interviews, focus groups, observation, and existing or secondary data. I know we have gone through this a bit already, so we'll just go through the next section fairly quickly. So tests and assessments. These are standardized and/or researcher-conducted data collection instructions designed to measure things like personality, aptitude, achievement, or performance on some specific construct or constructs. And this category includes tests of intelligence, personality, achievement, which are often used for both clinical and research purposes, among with tests of many, many other constructs. So advantages of this method is that it can provide measures of many characteristics of a person or people. It's often standardized, so the same stimulus is provided to all participants here. And I know you've briefly discussed standardization in lecture, but going a bit more into it, this means that the tests are administered under very exact conditions. So the participants are not allowed to stop during certain parts of the test, like look at their phone or any other stimuli, and the administrators must read from a script so that they say the exact same thing to each participant. If any of the standardization conditions are not met, the test results are considered invalid. And another advantage of this strategy is that it allows comparability of common measures across research populations in a very valid or true way. So some disadvantages are that tests might not be appropriate for a local or unique population. Open-ended questions or probing are not permitted, as you can probably imagine, given the such strict standardization of some of them. And tests are sometimes biased against certain groups of people. And an example of a test that might not be appropriate or might be biased against certain populations is an intelligence test that relies heavily on information taught in, say, a US classroom and asks participants information about past American presidents, the government structure in the US, things like that. So this might be fairly common knowledge across the USA, and it might be a valid thing to ask US citizens, but we in Canada would likely not know a lot of the answers, let alone someone from a culture halfway around the world. So the test would obviously not be a fair measure of intelligence to any non-US citizen. So another method is questionnaires. And we're quite familiar with these. These are generally a structured self-report data collection instrument completed by the research participant. And many of you are using pre-existing questionnaires, like say the Beck Depression Inventory, or making up your own questionnaires in your own research projects. There's quite a few advantages to these. They're good for measuring attitudes and eliciting other content from participants. They can provide information about participants' subjective perspectives and ways of thinking, and they can be administered to probability samples and larger groups of participants because they are often cheap to administer and do not take much or sometimes any of the researcher's time, especially if the researcher is sending participants a link to a survey that they just complete on their own time. The researcher doesn't really have to do anything once they have it set up. Disadvantages. So a major disadvantage is that these measures are sometimes lacking validation. And I know I've discussed this a little bit a few times in tutorial. What does this mean? So just because we make up questions that we think measure a construct, which can be anything, depression, anxiety, fear, extroversion, any construct, that doesn't mean that the questions actually do measure it. Even the most experienced researchers are not infallible, and sometimes we are in reality capturing a similar construct, but not the one we want, or we're capturing a totally different construct just by accident. So therefore, many widely used pre-existing questionnaires, some of the ones that you're using, even if you are using a pre-existing one, they go through extensive research-based validation processes before they are actually used to make sure that they are measuring what we are really interested in. So this is generally why I urged you to always try and pick a pre-existing measure to use in your own study, as they are much more validated than anything that you're going to make up yourself, which really isn't validated at all. And while the questionnaires you make up are often fine for the purposes of the class 201, they would never fly in an actual research setting. And other disadvantages are that participants can choose not to respond to certain items, resulting in missing data, which we don't want. And people filling out questionnaires might not recall important information, especially if you're asking about something that happened to them 5-10 years ago, and they might lack self-awareness. So they might be untruthful on questionnaires on purpose, or they just might not have the insight into their actions that allows them to answer in a truthful way. So now on to interviews. Interviews are where an interviewer asks the participant a series of questions, often with prompting for additional information. And sometimes interview protocols are highly structured and they have been previously validated, which means they have been tested to make sure they're capturing the focal construct, just like we just talked about for a validated questionnaire, while others are a little bit looser with their protocols and just have been created by researchers for the purpose of the study. And advantages of interviews includes the probing and posing of follow-up questions by the interviewer. If the participant responds and kind of gives half the information, but not all of it, the researcher can easily follow up on it and get all of the information they need. The interviews can provide in-depth information into a construct, and closed-ended interviews can provide very exact information needed by the researcher. And Some disadvantages are that in-person interviews are often expensive and time-consuming. The investigator effects or demand characteristics might occur. So this is where untrained interviews, sorry, this is not demand characteristics. This is just investigator effects, and they might occur. And this is where untrained interviewers can distort data by succumbing to personal biases or just by exhibiting poor interviewing skills. And also the perceived anonymity by respondents might be low. And this means some respondents may be very reluctant to discuss highly personal matters or distressing matters, just because they're sitting in front of someone face-to-face that they just don't know. Whereas something like a questionnaire might be able to capture those matters better because they're not actually sitting in front of a real person. Now, focus groups. They are a little less frequently used method of data collection, and they are more frequently used in qualitative rather than quantitative research. And this is collection of data in a group situation where a moderator leads a discussion with a small group of people. Advantages of these are that they are useful for exploring ideas and concepts. They can provide a window into the participants' internal thoughts, similar to interviews. And similar to interviews, they also allow for probing of participants' answers. Disadvantages include that it might be difficult to find a focus group moderator with good facilitative and rapport building skills, which is needed to conduct a good focus group. They might be dominated by one or two very loud or outgoing participants. So other participants might be quieter and not be able to say their piece. And it might be difficult to generalize results if small unrepresentative samples of participants are used. However, I will say that often the point of a focus group is not to generalize results and instead to just generate exploratory ideas for future, maybe more quantitative research studies. So for example, a researcher might be interested in what issues are most important to a specific group of, say, marginalized individuals. And they might not be looking to examine a specific question. They might just be looking to generate some research questions that are important to the group themselves or that are issues that they commonly experience that the researcher wouldn't even know about because they are not part of that group. Next, there's observation. This is when a researcher watches and records events or the behavioral patterns of people, and recording of participants' responses or reactions is also classified as observation. So this is one of the more classic methods of data collection in psychology, even though I'd say it's not quite as common as it used to be. Advantages of this are that it allows one to directly see what people do without having to rely on what they say they do. So you might be getting more truthful responses if you're actually observing their behavior. It can provide a relatively objective measurement of behavior, especially if you're using a standardized observation protocol. And this is similar to a standardized test. It's just that it's been validated before. And you can be more certain that it's measuring the exact construct, behavior-based construct that you are interested in as a researcher. And the observer can determine what does not occur. So this is often, what does not occur is often just as important as what does occur. And disadvantages of this are that the reasons for the observed behavior that you are recording might be unclear, and often you can't just go up and ask participants about it. Reactive effects or demand characteristics, it's also known as demand characteristics, might occur when respondents know they're being observed. So they might behave in atypical ways. They might try to mess with the researcher's results, but more frequently, they usually just try and act in a more socially desirable way because they know they're being watched and they don't want the researchers to think poorly of them. And Sampling of observed people and settings might be limited, as there are certain behaviors that are pretty much impossible to directly observe, like violent behavior or some mental illness symptomology. And lastly, we have existing or secondary data. And I'm honestly surprised more of you did not choose to use this method, as it is actually one of it's a favorite of researchers in psychology. It's used all the time, especially in clinical psychology. And as we've discussed a bit before, this is a collection of data that were left behind or originally used for something different than the current research study. I referred to this as archival data, as it is often in the form of hospital or other medical records, police records, university student records, or some other form of system or organization record of service users. Advantages of this are that it can be used to examine people and their behaviors in different time periods, i.e. the past. So you can do some really cool things like find a sample of people from 20 plus years ago and then match them to a sample of people from the present day and compare both samples on a focal construct. It's useful for exploration of research questions. It's inexpensive and a low burden on participants, as they often, as I've said before, don't even know that you're doing the study or collecting their data. Disadvantages of this method are that it might be outdated, it might be representative of only one perspective or population, and it might not address or directly address the question of interest, as you often cannot probe or follow up. And I've experienced this a few times when a certain research question really interests me, but I only have access to data that is related to the question just a little bit, but doesn't allow me to measure all of the variables I need. This is actually sort of the case in my second data collection example, which I will discuss in just a couple minutes. So now you've proposed your data collection strategy in your methods section of your proposal, which means that you should have written in future tense. Because you haven't done any of it yet. It was in the future. However, you will need to switch and describe all the collection methods in past tense in the methods section of your final report, as you will have already, quote unquote, done it at that time, even though you haven't yet, and I know that. You have hypothetically already done it. As I mentioned on my proposal feedback slide, many students didn't organize their methods section that well in their proposals. This structure is a standard layout that most of psychological research uses, and there's rarely a good reason to deviate from it. Therefore, I am strongly recommending that you split your methods section into participants, procedure, and materials subheadings, as seen on the slide there for your final report. Using this layout further improves your organization, which means it's easier for me to read and mark, and it also encourages you to consider what information goes under which subheading and to not repeat information twice. So now I'll quickly go through each section and what I expect to be included in it in your final report once again. So the participants section usually comes first. Here it's most important that you state how many participants you recruited and who they were. Remember, the number of participants was supposed to be informed by past research. I also needed the number of participants to generate data, so I did let you know if you didn't include it. Additional to the sample number, you should state if your participants came from a particular population or if they needed to have some specific inclusion criteria to participate. Examples of this include if you recruited participants from an inpatient hospital or prison setting, or if they needed to have a specific diagnosis like bipolar disorder or autism spectrum disorder. And you can see an example on the slide of how you might phrase this when writing about it in this section. A common mistake here is to discuss how you recruited your participants. So that does not go here. It kind of makes sense that it would, but it makes more sense that it goes in the procedures section, which we will talk about next. So the procedure section is where you describe how you collected your data in a step-by-step fashion. Don't take that literally and don't use bullet points or numbered paragraphs, of course. Write in full paragraphs, but describe everything you required your participants to do chronologically. So start with how you recruited or selected your participants, then describe all actions participants were required to complete throughout the study. This could be as simple as completing a couple questionnaires online or as complex as an activity in a laboratory setting. Here, you may refer to the measures you use. So for example, participants were administered X questionnaire and then a citation for it, and then Y questionnaire, and then include a citation after that as well. But you don't describe the measures yet. That's actually in the next section. If your participants did not need to do anything, as you collected data via an archival data or file review method, you would instead describe what you as the researcher did to obtain your data. I'm not sure if anyone used that method though. Last is the materials section, although you may include it before the procedure section if you feel that makes more sense or flows better in your paper. Here you describe all materials you use to manipulate and/or measure your variables. I highly recommend splitting this section into two further subsections, independent variable and dependent variable, as two subheadings. That way, it's really easy for readers, i.e. me, to see exactly how you measured each of your two focal constructs. So see the APA formatting tutorial again on how to format each of these headers and subheaders, as that was another aspect of the proposals that wasn't always well done, but I rarely commented on it because there were usually other things I wanted to discuss. If you are using one or more pre-existing measures, you would describe the measure's general structure. For example, how many items does it have? How are the items rated or scored? Is it self-report or does the researcher administer it? You must include citations if you are using a pre-existing measure. A lot of people didn't do that too, as it is technically plagiarism to not cite it. And I really don't want to write up anyone for that. Please book an appointment with me if you are unsure how to find a citation for a measure, as it is not just a matter of citing the last article that used it, which again, I saw a couple people do, and that's not right. If you are using one or more measures you created yourself, you don't need to cite them, of course, because you made them, but you still need to describe its structure in the same way as you would a pre-existing measure. So again, how many items it has, how are the items rated, etc. If your independent variable is straightforward, something like age or different levels of a true experimental design, so it's not being measured, it's actually it's a manipulation, you don't necessarily need to describe a measure, but you do need to describe any materials you need to manipulate that construct, like different versions of a story vignette that's presented to participants, different songs that you play them, anything like that. So that would still go in the materials section because they are materials you are using. Lastly, do not reproduce the actual measure right within the materials or the methods section at all. Just describe and cite it, or cite them, multiple measures, and then you reproduce the measure or measures in full, unless I indicated otherwise in my feedback to you, in the appendices. If you have any concerns about reproducing your measures in full in the appendices, please book a meeting with me, again, as I'll be able to advise on what you should do. There are a few occasions where it might just be way too much work to reproduce it, or you can't actually access the material. So we can talk about that. Okay, so I wanted to give a couple examples of real life data collection I have done or will be doing to further illustrate the process. For my master's thesis, I'm examining if there are certain characteristics of threats and individuals who utter them that can predict future likelihood of violent behavior happening after the threat is made. You likely gathered this or generally what my master's is on from reading the sample ethics consent form I sent around for this study a couple of weeks ago. So for this project, just splitting it down by those three categories we just discussed, my participants will be approximately 400 individuals recruited off of a neat part of Amazon called Amazon Mechanical Turk, or MTurk, which is a way for researchers to connect with individuals looking to complete surveys and get paid for it. In particular, individuals will need to have made a threat of violence against another person within the last 5 years to participate in my study. So that's my main inclusion criterion. For statistical purposes, I'm hoping to recruit about 200 who have made a threat, but just left it at that and did not go on to commit physical violence, and another 200 who made a threat and did go on to commit physical violence of some type afterwards. So to conduct this study, I'll post an advertisement on MTurk that clearly outlines my inclusion criteria, i.e. that they must have made a threat recently. If participants think they meet the inclusion criteria and they want to participate, they will be able to click a link, which will take them to the consent form. They'll indicate they consent, and then they will be directed to my survey hosted on Qualtrics. That will take them about 1 hour to complete, and then after they'll be paid for their time. My materials are a little convoluted. Basically, I want to ask them about as many areas of their life that could possibly predict future violent behavior as possible. So I completed a comprehensive literature review to figure out as many risk factors as possible that previous literature has shown are associated with future violent offending more generally. So when I say violent offending generally, I mean not just violence following a threat, but all instances of physical violence. So I made a list of all these risk factors, which include things like substance abuse, history of past violent behavior, and impulsivity. And then I matched each of these constructs to pre-existing validated self-report measures of them, which I included in my survey. That's why it's so long and it takes an hour. So I'm basically investigating if a large number of independent variables, which are these different risk factors that are supported by prior research, can predict my dependent variable, which is violent behavior following a threat of violence. And here's another fairly different example that involves a project I led last year while I was a research coordinator at the Coquitlam Forensic Psychiatric Hospital. This study was a fairly simple exploratory one that examined how frequently forensic inpatients engage in acts of targeted violence and what types of mental illness symptomology precede these acts. Targeted violence can be defined as violence that is planned, goal-directed, or intentionally committed against a particular specific person or group of people. So my participants were 293 forensic inpatients who had resided at the hospital between the years of 2000 and 2005. Of course, that was a long time ago, so I wasn't directly interacting with the participants, and they didn't know I was conducting research on them. This was a case of archival or file review secondary data collection. Since one of my research questions focused on the prevalence of targeted violence in this sample, I identified a subsample of 56 participants who had committed an act of targeted violence. For my procedure, I reviewed all participants' files for a few certain variables and reviewed the files of the subsample of patients who had committed targeted violence in even greater depth for even more variables. These variables included things like diagnosis at time of offense, substance use, and psychotic symptoms displayed at time of offense. As this was a file review study, my main material was a self-made data coding protocol that allowed me to collect the information I was interested in from the patient's files in a very structured fashion. Because I was not asking the patients themselves to self-report data and instead just looking at file information written by other mental health professionals, it was easier for me to assess a number of the variables I was interested in. So for example, instead of giving each participant a pre-existing validated measure of substance use, I was able to merely check off the substance use question if there was information in the file that clearly stated the participant was using substances at the time of offense. So I hope these examples were helpful. I wasn't able to include a true experimental design as I actually haven't used one yet. They're quite rare in forensic settings as there are not many variables we are interested in that we can ethically manipulate, as I'm sure you can possibly surmise. Okay, and now we're on to assignment 7. There are 4 questions. The first 3 are on this slide, and then the 4th is on the next slide, so please don't forget the 4th and hand in only 3 questions. First, you need to outline what the 6 methods of data collection mentioned in lecture and in this tutorial are, which should be pretty easy. Second, you'll think about the use of any of these methods in your project. So A, choose one of the methods of data collection that you described in your proposal, define it, and briefly describe what you did. So here you are choosing one of the 6 methods that we just talked about in tutorial. That is the one that you used in your study. And then to B, identify 3 advantages and 3 disadvantages of this method of data collection. Use your proposal as an example and illustrate these advantages and disadvantages. So for this one especially, make sure you are referencing your proposal while stating the 3 advantages and disadvantages. Don't just list them. You won't receive full marks if you don't reference your proposal here. And number 3, how might you overcome the limitations of your proposed method of data collection? So I'm just looking for a paragraph or 2 here. It doesn't have to be anything groundbreaking. I just want you to think a little bit. And then number 4, this section is mainly aiming to collect the missing information that some students did not include in their research proposal. So if you included everything that was asked, this should be really easy. Just repeat what you wrote in your proposal. So 4th, state your hypothesis, dependent variable and independent variable. You've done that quite a number of times. You should have that information. Consider, will you be manipulating your independent variable? So do you have a true experiment, or will you be measuring your independent variable, i.e. a correlational experiment? So if you are manipulating your independent variable, how many levels of it are there? How many groups are there in the study? Often there will be the same number of groups as there are levels of your independent variable because it's one group per level. That makes sense. And how many participants are you wanting per group? And if you are measuring your independent variable and it's a correlational study, how many participants are there in the study? Because you will typically not have groups. So again, make sure you are answering all 4 questions. Feel free to use ATA formatting when you submit if you want to practice, but it's not a strict requirement. As long as it's a formatting that is easy to read, that's fine. And this is due in a week on July 14th, the Wednesday at 8:30 a.m. PST. And that's all. Thanks for watching, and I'll be available for drop-in appointments at the usual time today.